What kind of nation builds an asylum for Native people, then fills it with men, women, and children who may never have been insane at all? In Canton, South Dakota, the federal government created exactly that place, the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians, a prison disguised as care. Behind its walls, Native patients were stripped from their families, buried in unmarked graves, and trapped under diagnoses that investigators later found were often baseless. Some were confined for supposed mania, some for resisting authority, some for reasons so vague they read like cruelty. More than 120 people died there. Many never returned home. Tonight we follow the paper trail the government left behind. Reports, cemetery records, and investigations that exposed neglect, coercion, and a system that used psychiatry as a weapon of conquest. The horror is real. The records are real. And the silence is part of the crime too. Stay with me, because the documents only grow darker. What happened in Canton was not rumor, but record. This story carries grief, anger, and unbearable silence. By the end, the asylum will look different forever. In the closing years of the 19th century, federal officials promoted Canton. They called it relief for Native patients, but politics shaped everything. South Dakota boosters wanted jobs, contracts, and prestige for Canton. Congress authorized the institution, despite opposition from interior officials. Construction money followed in the appropriation legislation of 1900. The asylum stood east of town, isolated above the river. It opened to patients in the early 20th century there. Its federal purpose was singular and chillingly specific from inception. This was the only federal asylum created exclusively for Indians. That fact alone reveals segregation disguised as specialized benevolence. The broader setting was the age of allotment policies. Native nations were losing land, children, language, autonomy, and protection. Boarding schools enforced assimilation, while reservations remained under federal surveillance. Disability labels fit neatly into that machinery of control. At Canton, confinement could begin far from any courtroom safeguard. Reservation superintendents and agents pushed commitments through weak procedures. Even later, officials struggled to locate proper commitment records. Patients arrived from many tribal nations across North America. Some were adults, some were young, and some children. Many remained for years inside a custodial institutional world. The hospital offered little that resembled meaningful psychiatric treatment. Reports describe housing, restraints, poor records, and meager care. A nationwide survey in the 1920s found minimal care. Later inspections by psychiatrist Samuel Silk deepened the alarm. He questioned record-keeping, conditions, and numerous patients' actual diagnoses. Those findings helped drive the institution toward eventual closure. For this script, the main sources are National Park Service, South Dakota State Historical Society materials, Berkeley, PubMed, historians. Together, they show an asylum embedded within settler colonial policy. Not merely neglect, but confinement serving dispossession, erasure, and silence. But the most disturbing truth is still ahead tonight. Canton was not merely a neglected hospital for Indians. Investigators found people confined who showed no clear psychosis. Others disappeared into years of custody without safeguards. Inside those brick buildings, punishment often replaced treatment entirely. The farther we go into testimony and inspection reports, the clearer the pattern becomes. This institution punished difference, protected local power, and buried its victims quietly nearby. The institution's violence began with the act of commitment itself. At Canton, freedom could vanish before any doctor examined someone. Reservation authorities often initiated confinement through flimsy, improvised procedures. Later officials admitted commitment records were missing or inadequate. That legal fog mattered because confinement could become nearly permanent. Patients entered a system designed around custody, not healing. Many were young, which makes the records more haunting. Historical studies found several inmates were still children there. Others were in their 20s, far from elderly senility. This was no refuge for age-related decline alone. It absorbed people the colonial system considered troublesome, vulnerable, culturally misunderstood, physically different, rebellious, or simply inconvenient. A Berkeley account describes Native people imprisoned for reasons having nothing to do with recognized mental illness whatsoever. Some had epilepsy or visible injuries from earlier trauma. Some quarreled with schoolmates, spouses, or local authorities. Some, researchers argue, were punished for resisting assimilation. Once admitted, distance itself became another instrument of force. Families were separated by vast geography and federal bureaucracy. That first cruelty was disappearance under the language of care. Inside, the asylum offered conditions investigators later considered disgraceful. A national survey in the 1920s found minimal care. Samuel Silk's inspections described deplorable conditions and poor record-keeping. Published histories call the institution a custodial total environment. Patients lived in cramped quarters with limited sanitation and privacy. The so-called hospital building barely functioned as hospital. It had only rudimentary facilities for actual medical treatment. Daily life revolved around surveillance, order, obedience, and dependency. Reports suggest attendants with little training wielded enormous authority. That imbalance opened space for routine humiliation and abuse. Pamina Yellowbird's summary of archival evidence is brutal. She writes of trauma, neglect, maltreatment, torture, and death. Her account also cites Silk on widespread physical restraint. Patients were chained, restrained, or locked away for convenience. Not for therapy, not for recovery, but management. The institution reduced human beings to administrative burdens and bodies that generated salaries, contracts, and a local economy. Bodies removed from communities, ceremonies, responsibilities, and treaty futures. In that setting, every restraint carried a second meaning. It immobilized a person and the nation behind them. The case files also reveal how absurd diagnoses could become. One Lakota man was labeled with horse-stealing mania. He denied the accusation and protested his own innocence. Doctors at St. Elizabeth's reportedly found no gross disorder. Yet he remained trapped in federal psychiatric custody anyway. Later, he was transferred to Canton for more confinement. His story matters because it strips away every excuse. This was not careful medicine confronting undeniable psychosis. This was power riding madness onto a native body. Berkeley's reporting says he fought for release for years. He complained about abuse and tried smuggling information outward. Remarkably, he survived and eventually left the institution alive. Many others did not receive that impossible chance. Patients could remain for extraordinary stretches of their lives. One woman, Emma Amiot, was held about 10 years. Officials had been told she was mentally well beforehand. Another inmate, Silk found, had endured 24 years. Such terms resembled punishment more than any clinical intervention. The asylum converted uncertain diagnosis into endless federal custody, and every extra year deepened isolation, grief, and institutional damage. As scrutiny increased, the institution's moral collapse became undeniable. Employee complaints had already accused Superintendent Harry Hummer severely. More than a dozen workers alleged mistreatment and inhumane conditions. Outside investigators then measured Canton against other mental institutions. The comparison was damning, especially in death and discharge rates. PubMed's archival summary says those rates compared unfavorably nationally. Silk's reports pushed still further than statistical embarrassment alone. He questioned whether many patients required institutionalization in first place. One article summarizes his estimate at 35 to 40 of 90 patients unnecessarily confined during inspection. Another historical account notes later charges that more than 10 patients were not psychotic and should not have been held there at all under confinement. Different counts reflect different reviews across separate years. Together, they point in the same brutal direction. Canton was not simply failing to treat mental illness. It was also incarcerating Native people without solid justification. That distinction matters because neglect alone suggests incompetence. These records suggest something colder, a colonial institution functioning through misdiagnosis, indifference, and administrative disappearance. Closure did not come because justice suddenly awakened in Washington. It came after years of complaints, inspections, and embarrassment. Interior officials moved against Hummer and against the institution. The asylum was ordered closed in the early 30s. Patients judged sane were discharged or released from confinement. Others were transferred to St. Elizabeth's in Washington afterward. Even that ending carried the logic of federal control. People were still moved like cases, not relatives. By then, more than 350 native people had been confined there from many tribal nations nationwide. At least 121 died at Canton. Men, women, children, and even newborns were buried nearby. The graves were left without the dignity of markers. Today, the cemetery remains the clearest surviving witness there. The buildings are gone, razed after the institution ended. A golf course came to occupy much of sight. That transformation feels almost allegorical in its indifference. Pleasure above ground, erased suffering beneath the fairways. But the dead remain, and so do the records. They refuse the old fiction that Canton was care. And that is where the story turns inward on us. Because Canton is not only about one closed asylum, it is about what governments can justify through paperwork. Before we end, we need to face the aftermath and the silence that followed those graves for generations. For the victims, the consequences reached far beyond death alone. Some never returned to their families, languages, or homelands. Some survived only after years of confinement and stigma. Others were transferred elsewhere, still trapped inside federal custody. At least 121 people died there. Their cemetery, now the main surviving site, testifies quietly. The graves represent many tribal nations and many interrupted futures. Parents lost children, communities lost singers, workers, witnesses, relatives. History lost stories that institutions never bothered preserving carefully. As for accountability, it arrived late and incompletely. Inspections condemned the asylum, and closure finally came. But closure is not the same as justice. No act could restore stolen years or buried names. No report could undo the fear built into families. Even the documentary record was fractured, missing, or careless. That administrative neglect was itself another form of violence. It made suffering harder to trace and easier to dismiss. Yet historians, activists, and descendants kept reopening the file. They argued that Canton belonged within a larger colonial history, not as an isolated scandal, but a revealing mechanism. A mechanism linking psychiatry, guardianship, allotment, and indigenous dispossession. That argument is persuasive because the evidence coheres. Confinement removed people from communities at moments of vulnerability. Federal wardship made legal resistance weak and inconsistent. Disability language helped transform coercion into official benevolence. And once labeled, Native people could be disappeared administratively. Canton forces a brutal question onto the present. How often does power still rename domination as protection? If this story unsettles us, it should, because the archive shows cruelty wearing the mask of care. The Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians was never only a failed hospital hidden on the edge of Canton. It was a federal instrument born inside conquest, allotment, assimilation, and the belief that native difference invited control. Its paperwork spoke of care, maintenance, treatment, and order. Its history speaks instead of confinement, neglect, and erasure. That contrast is the lesson we cannot avoid tonight. When institutions define a people as dependent or defective, abuse becomes easier to authorize and harder to see. Canton proves that colonial violence did not always arrive with rifles, cavalry, or open massacres before witnesses. Sometimes it arrived in ledgers, diagnoses, transfer papers, annual reports, and buildings presented as humanitarian progress. Sometimes it arrived through silence after the doors closed. The dead at Canton ask more from history now. They ask for names, context, memory, and moral honesty. They ask us to reject every comforting lie completely. Not because the past can be repaired by language, but because forgetting always prepares the ground for repetition. So remember this place for what records reveal precisely: an asylum built for Indians, then used against them. And remember the final indictment buried beneath its grass. The government called it treatment, but too often it functioned as disappearance. Thank you for staying through this difficult history tonight. Please subscribe, like the video, and share it thoughtfully. Watch the next story if you want deeper context. These archives matter because remembrance resists official forgetting. Learning this past is one way of honoring them.